way. Your job's a joke, you broke, your love life's the old way. It's like you're always stuck in second gear. When it hasn't been your day, or maybe your month, or even your year. But I'll be there for you.
Que onda, way? Welcome back, you guys, to the third lecture on the causes of the Mexican Revolution. Today we're discussing the rise of Madero. All right, and let's review last class. Here you can see a sad Mexican that was basically the epitome of last class. So we talked last time about a man named Porfirio Diaz and his tyranny over the country, and we divided it a bit with like each industry, what it was like. For example, we talked about the Terrenos Baldios law that basically stole the land from the people to force them to work on it in haciendas. We then talked about the different industries, oil, mining, etc., and how the foreigners had pretty much purchased all the important resources. If anybody went on strike because they were getting less money than the foreigners were, they would either be shot by the corporation or the government. So no matter who you went to, your answer would be a bullet to the face. Horrible stuff. When it comes to railroads, it meant that Porfirio's men could now be anywhere at any time to stop a potential uprising or a strike or a boycott, so not good during that period of time. And Porfirio pretty much controlled every aspect of the government with his científicos. He controlled the military, the politics, the court systems. As soon as the economy slowed down a little bit, that's when things went haywire. That's when people began to say enough is enough. Even the middle class was ready for revolution, and so it began. So let's pause real quick so we can talk about Francisco Madero. All right. So, after 30 years of being in power, this is the big mistake that Porfirio made. He told an American journalist that he thought he would step down in 1910. And as soon as the people heard about it, they began creating political parties. Candidates sought supporters, and Diaz looked around and he thought that they were such small fish that he could basically pick his successor and still be a behind-the-scenes kind of president. Eventually, though, he saw that people were really getting a lot of popularity, and it looked like he wouldn't be in power like he thought, so he took back what he had said and announced he'd actually run for a sixth time. Now, one of the most leading candidates at this time was a man named Francisco Madero, and he was completely outraged. He publicly spoke against Diaz running again when he said he wouldn't publicly to the world, and he ran on a pro-democracy platform. As soon as he publicly went against Porfirio Diaz, as you could imagine, Diaz threw him in jail, and then Diaz won the election through electoral fraud. Now, somehow Madero eventually escaped. He wrote the first of many plans you will talk about. A plan, in the instance of the Mexican Revolution, is going to be kind of like a campaign promise in the modern age for the United States to the people. And every single revolutionary leader is going to have their own plan to the people to help fix the country. So one of the first ones we're learning about is the Plan de San Luis Potosí, basically calling that election in the 1910s fraudulent and promising political reform. Now the mistake that he made is that he did not discuss land issues, which was a huge thing, the hacienda problems, or labor issues, the working conditions, etc., which is what most people really wanted to hear. He basically strictly promised political reform, and then he escaped to the United States. Now, when he was in the United States, he called for all Mexican citizens to rise up against Porfirio Diaz. Now, what was already happening in Mexico is that in the south, a man named Emiliano Zapata, a person you're going to know very well very soon, in a province called Morelos, he was already staging a coup or a war right next to Mexico City, the capital. And then in the north, a man named Pascual Orozco and Pancho Villa were already beginning to get the northerners to rise up and fight. So the fighting had already begun before he was calling up, but he really rallied everybody to see that there was another way, a third way, which could be under his leadership. So here we can see the magazine, the United States magazine. Greelman is the person that actually interviewed him, and in this magazine, President Porfirio Diaz said, I think I'm done. I've served my country long enough. Not. He would quickly run after. Here we can see an American newspaper, Madero issues a proclamation as president of the rebel government. So he would be the figurehead if the revolution actually wins. It would be Madero that was taking that risk. It would be his head on a stake if he failed. Here we can see the Plan de San Luis Potosí. The election, the one that just occurred, was a sham while he was in jail. We need political reform. He published this when he was living in Texas in the United States. And a very important slogan, basically the English translation was effective suffrage, the right to vote, no more re-election of dictators. And it is in Spanish, sufragio electivo y no reelección. And we can see that this is actually a very big deal. If you look at, in the modern age, if you look at actual Mexican pesos, if you look really closely, you can see that it says it right there, electivo y no reelección. It's in there right next to the corn. Here we can see one of the many murals we'll be talking about when we talk about Mexican arts in the revolution. These are all the leaders right here that fought against Porfirio Diaz. But one of the most important ones is unquestionably Francisco Madero, who put his face forward. And here we can see that here's the face of Emiliano Zapata in the south, and Morelos, he's the one that is already fighting in the south next to the capital, Mexico City. His quote, "Better to die on your feet than live on your knees," a very famous quote. And then Pascual Orozco had gotten the northerners to fight against. And here we can see the map, just so you can see it. Orozco and Villa were here in the north, and then Zapata was here in the south. And eventually, Madero would come in and join forces with Orozco and Villa, and the three of them would eventually, fight themselves all the way down to the capital. All right? So let's look at this first of 3 videos today on Madero and his role in the revolution.
Well, the attitude toward Francisco Madero by that small elite circle that surrounded Diaz was that he was basically a crackpot. He was referred to as the little crazy one, el loquito. So Francisco Madero just simply wasn't taken seriously. He was almost considered like a fly, an irritant, a gnat.
What does get the attention of President Diaz is a proclamation known as the Plan de San Luis Potosí. It calls for his removal.
Madero was not a radical. What he wanted was to have elections, free elections in Mexico, and he wanted to be president. And, he meant well, but he wasn't a man who was going to overturn the hacienda system. He wasn't a great friend of labor. He just happened to come on the scene at the right time.
Madero's call to revolution sparks numerous uprisings. In the northern states of Sonora and Chihuahua, ranchers and small businessmen had band together to form anti-re-electionist clubs to depose Diaz. Now they take up arms. In the U.S., President Taft is caught off guard. These uprisings could easily threaten American interests.
Well, Taft, because he didn't know what the hell was going on in Mexico, didn't know what to do. So he basically did nothing directly, but allow his emissary in Mexico City, Henry Lane Wilson, a great deal of space to do what Henry Lane Wilson thought was in the American interest.
In Mexico City, Ambassador Wilson is the Dean of the International Diplomatic Corps. Over the years, he and Diaz become allies. Diaz provides stability in a business-friendly environment. Wilson provides American financial and political support. But with Madero's declaration of war and the amassing of revolutionary troops in the north and south, there is concern in Mexico City and in Washington about how Diaz will weather this storm, which is quickly closing in on him on several fronts.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. Unfortunately, his reign will be short-lived, as you'll see next time. Let's pause so you can write this down. Okay, so, and this is where the bit of soap opera-ness comes in. It'll be a lot more next time, but we already got a lot of names we're juggling here. We've got Porfirio Diaz, Madero. Now we've got Madero returns in 1911, and he will join 3,000 Northern Army soldiers, rebel forces, fighting under Pascual Orozco, and also the legendary Pancho Villa, who you will know very well very soon. So the three of them would fight eventually in the city called Ciudad Juarez, which is right on the border between the United States and Mexico. Now, Diaz's general refused to leave the military garrison, the barracks where his people were. And although Madero tried the negotiation route, Villa Orozco, the much more dangerous rebels that they were, went against his advice and eventually forced the general to heroically surrender. With this victory in Ciudad Juarez, it was a huge deal because now the rebels officially controlled the railway port into the United States. This was one of the largest markets that the Mexicans had into exporting their goods, and they could steal food, supplies, and weaponry, either way, from the Americans or from the Mexicans on this train. This train would be a huge, huge win for the Northerners, who can now go up and down Mexico and fight to liberate all the cities along the railroads. Now, Zapata, which is right next to, he had an amazing victory right next to the Mexico City in Morelos. For 6 days, he and 4,000 rebel soldiers fought against around 400 rebel troops, so it was a lost cause for the federal government anyways. They were able to kill about 1,000 of his soldiers. A fourth of his army died before he slaughtered the 400 well-armed federal troops. And these two huge battles pretty much was the beginning of the end for Porfirio Diaz. These are the two big battles to know. And here we can see in the north, Madero and Pascual Ortiz meeting here in the north. There is Pancho Villa. They met in the north and they joined forces. Here we can see the Battle of Ciudad Juarez. How amazing do they look with these awesome sombreros fighting against the government. A real civil war. It eventually led to victory. They controlled the railroad now. That was a huge win, and they would use, the Northern Division, the Northern Army would use this railroad to their advantage. We'll talk about later the soldaderas, the female soldiers that would follow the Northerners. And here we can see the Southern Battle of Morelos. This is the one that had the 4,000 rebel soldiers against the 400. 1,000 of these people lost their life trying to gain freedom. And here we can see the very famous Emiliano Zapata. Here is a Mexican, an interesting headline saying that he is the modern Attila the Hun. Of course, if you were in the government, you did not like this guy who was fighting right next to your capital and waging a war. So here is a video showing and discussing the origins of Villa and Zapata. Take note of how much the people in Morelos adore Emiliano Zapata, truly a hero, a people's man, like in the United States, a Malcolm X or a Martin Luther King kind of figure in Mexico.
The idea that he was a major Robin Hood, taking from the rich, giving to the poor, before the revolution, is a legend.
Villa aprende rápidamente las técnicas militares de artillería, todo lo que tenga que ver con la ciencia militar. Y la otra cosa es que ante el pueblo, Villa es un hombre exactamente como cualquier campesino, como cualquier minero, como cualquier jornalero, como cualquier peón. Entonces se le agrega todo esto, lo que él ha aprendido como jefe de bandoleros, a cómo tratar a la gente, y todo esto lo hace un gigante.
Francisco Villa is a man of contradictions who embodies the spirit of the northern border states of Sonora and Chihuahua. Bold, brash with a flair for the dramatic, he never passes up an opportunity to be photographed. Down in the southern state of Morelos, a quieter, more calculating leader has captured the hearts and minds of the people.
Emiliano Zapata was probably the most dangerous figure for the moderates, for the liberals, for the reformers. He was dangerous because of his demand for land reform. It was a major threat to the whole notion of how power would be organized and had been organized in Mexico previously. So when Emiliano Zapata demanded the respect of these people, it was an incredible threat to that social order that took for granted the assumption that they had the right to rule and that these indios, these descalzos, these peasants, the people who didn't wear shoes, the people that had no education and so on, had no right to have a place in Mexico.
Era un hombre de buen cuerpo, era un hombre muy noble, pero valiente. Eso sí, cuando yo anduve con él, 2 años nada más, nosotros lo cuidábamos a él como él nos cuidaba a nosotros. Y ese era su pensamiento de él.
That was heartwarming, wasn't it? So let's get our last slide in today. Let's pause so you can write this down. All right, so the end of Porfirio Diaz, after he lost in Morelos and in the north in Ciudad Juarez, he eventually had to sign the Treaty of Ciudad Juarez. And what did this call for? Basically, Diaz's resignation. He would no longer be the dictator for after 35 years. But at the same time, his generals would be retained. This would be a problem. To keep the economy running slowly, they would have to pay reparations to any foreign investors who had lost anything during this turbulent year of fighting. The rebels were going to disband and no longer be armed, and elections were promised in 6 months. Now, you can already kind of foresee how some of these are going to be problematic, and it will lead to a very short Madero presidency, some of these beginning problems in this treaty. So, the loyal revolutionaries that follow Maduro, many followed him, many said, okay, this is much better than what we had before. But the problems that Madero faced were that basically he was of the opinion that if the political system was fixed, basically if we didn't have Porfirio Diaz and his tyranny, eventually the social and economic problems, the wage issues, the labor issues, the hacienda issues, all these problems would eventually be fixed. But the first thing we got to do is fix our political system. He did not focus enough on the social and economic problems, and that would lead to his downfall, in addition to the fact that he kept a lot of these Porfirio generals in power. Now, the revolutionary leaders are pissed off about the fact that these people are in power, even though they slaughtered their soldiers. The generals are still in power. They were not going to lay down their weapons. They were not really keen. They don't know they could trust this Madero guy. Is he just another Porfirio Diaz? And once again, nothing was even stated to change the issue with land reform, with the deeds. Nothing was discussed to help out with the common man, the common worker, the 90% of the population. So the revolutionary leaders, Pancho Villa, Orozco, Zapata, they felt like they were abandoned by Madero at this point. So here we can see Diaz's letter of resignation. It's in Spanish, so I can't read it to you, but there's his train back to the U.S. where he was exiled and he would eventually be killed. And here we can see the people that were signing the Treaty of Ciudad Juarez in the north. Once again, you can see Pascual, Madero, Villas in the back somewhere. Now, unfortunately, nobody would be happy. They would eventually blame Madero for selling out because he did not help the common man, and he kept Porfiristas, the generals that were in power before, in power. Here we can see the reign of Madero, domestic disturbance, strikes, food and work, please, and people trying to extract money. And here we can see the Plan de San Luis, and Madero wants his piece of the pie, and he can see all the other people that used to be in power trying to get a piece of the pie, but nobody would be happy. Nobody would get the full flan or cake. One last video for today, discussing the victory, the loss of Porfirio Diaz, the victory for the revolutionaries, and what's to come in the future.
Madero's plan to overthrow Porfirio Diaz turns into full-scale warfare. In the spring of 1911, he takes on Diaz's federal army at Casas Grandes, Chihuahua. Then the campaign continues north to the border city of Juarez.
In 1911, when Madero was besieging Ciudad Juarez and victory seemed in the offing, Madero suddenly hesitated. Porfirian emissaries warned him, if you attack Ciudad Juarez, bullets might fly across the border into the United States, the Americans will intervene, so it's too dangerous. And he decided to retreat from Ciudad Juarez.
Madero's revolutionary army is under the command of two generals who are eager to fight, Francisco Villa and Pascual Orozco.
Against the orders of Madero, they attacked Ciudad Juarez. Madero finally had to agree, and the revolutionaries gained a major victory, and that changed the whole relationship of forces in Mexico.
In Mexico City, Diaz cowers inside the presidential palace. Outside in the Zócalo, the central plaza, thousands clamor for his resignation. Madero spares Diaz's life under the condition he'll go into exile.
Cuando don Porfirio finalmente se dio cuenta que había que retirarse porque era la única manera que vieron de tratar de contener lo que estaba sucediendo. Frase famosa, verdadera o no, que haya dicho, Madero ha soltado un tigre, a ver cómo hace ahora para cabalgarlo. Pero es muy difícil cabalgar un tigre.
All right, so next time we're going to talk about the Madero presidency and how it quickly, like a novela, just fell into shambles, and how the revolutionaries who were not pleased would eventually go to war with him. Until next time. Órale! Hey, one more thing, I forgot to include the fact that you have an essay next time. Well, not really an essay, you have an outline next time. So, let's make sure that you've been reviewing and understanding this material. Next class, and don't tell your peers if they're not watching, let them get screwed, you're going to have 30 minutes to write up an outline as to how you would answer the following question. Analyze the political causes of the Mexican Revolution of 1910. Remember that you got to have a thesis. Make your paragraph headers the thesis points that you use in whatever thesis you think of in advance. Prove to me that you understand this material. Make sure you put in some facts from the lectures or from the book. I'll tell you what the book's going to be, what pages it'll be in advance. I'll provide earplugs for you this one time, and you'll keep those earplugs from now on. You can use them so you're not distracted by my lecture I'll be giving the rest of the class. Don't worry about the conclusion, but make sure you put as many facts as possible that are relevant to the idea of politics that caused the actual Mexican Revolution. Good luck and study hard.